Hey guys, in the medieval world, food wasn't just something you ate. It was a fragile, living thing that could betray you within hours if the weather turned, if the barrel leaked, or if the flies arrived first. We tend to picture spoiled food as a simple inconvenience fixed by refrigerators. Yet the deeper truth is far more layered and quietly relentless. Medieval Europeans lived inside an endless, invisible race against decay that shaped their entire calendar, their social hierarchies, and even their sense of what tasted good or safe. The spoilage wasn't merely the absence of modern technology. It was the unavoidable consequence of a world built on soil, seasons, and the limits of what the human hand and the medieval larder could actually hold back. I'd love to know, as you settle in wherever you are tonight, where exactly you're listening from and what piece of history you'd like us to quietly explore next. If this kind of thoughtful, unhurried look at the past helps you unwind, a gentle like on the video is a simple way to support more of these calm, long-form journeys. And if you find yourself returning to these stories, subscribing lets the next chapter arrive without you having to search for it. With that said, let us ease ourselves into the medieval day and see why, for the vast majority of people living between the 5th and 15th centuries across Europe, food turned against them so quickly. Picture a late summer morning in a typical English or French village around the year 1300. The harvest has just been brought in, the fields are stubble, and the air already carries the first hint of cooler nights. In the peasant cottage, the day's bread has been baked from the previous week's grain. It is dense, dark, and still warm from the hearth. By evening, if the weather is damp, small patches of blue-green mold will already be forming on the crust. The ale brewed last month tastes thin and slightly sour. The salted pork hanging from the rafters has developed a slick surface that the housewife scrapes away before slicing. Nothing dramatic has happened. This is simply how food behaved. The fundamental reason lay in the absence of anything that could reliably slow the natural processes we now understand as microbial activity. But medieval people experienced it through their senses and their inherited knowledge. Heat, moisture, and time were the three patient enemies. Without mechanical cooling, without airtight metal cans, without chemical preservatives beyond salt and smoke, every piece of food carried its own quiet clock. Grain, the backbone of nearly every diet, could last months if kept bone-dry in a well-built granary raised on stone pillars to keep rodents out. Yet the moment dampness crept in, weevils and mold claimed it. A single wet harvest could mean hunger by winter. Dairy told an even more urgent story. Milk straight from the cow soured within a day in summer, sometimes within hours if the pail had not been scalded properly. Butter churned that morning might turn rancid by the next if the dairy was not kept in the coolest part of the house or sunk into the ground. Cheese offered a longer life, but only after the laborious process of pressing, salting, and aging, and even then only the hardest varieties survived beyond a season. Eggs were a small miracle of nature's packaging, yet once the shell cracked or the weather warmed, they too joined the daily gamble. Meat presented the sharpest edge of the problem. Freshly slaughtered beef or mutton could not be kept more than a day or two without salting, smoking, or drying. In a castle kitchen, the surplus from a hunt might be roasted immediately for the lord's table, but the rest had to be dealt with before flies laid their eggs in it. The poorer household relied on the autumn pig killing, when every scrap was salted, packed into barrels, or hung in the chimney to cure in the smoke. Yet even well-salted bacon could develop a white bloom or a soft, unpleasant texture if the salt had not penetrated evenly or if the barrel lid had not been sealed with fat. The medieval larder was never truly cold. It was merely less warm than the outside air. What many modern listeners assume is that people simply accepted constant spoilage. The reality was more nuanced and more exhausting. They lived with a calendar of preservation that required constant attention. Late autumn was the season of slaughter and curing because the cold nights helped slow decay while the work was done. Spring brought the first fresh greens and the return of milk, but also the risk of the flux if last winter's stores had begun to rot. Summer meant eating what could be gathered or caught that day. River fish, wild herbs, early fruits. Autumn was the frantic race to dry apples, store roots in sand-filled pits, and ferment cabbage into sauerkraut-like preparations that would keep through the dark months. The very climate of northern Europe worked against long storage. Humid summers, long damp winters, and the lack of truly arid conditions meant that techniques perfected in the drier Mediterranean or the Middle East did not translate easily. Salt itself, the most important preservative, was expensive and sometimes impure. In coastal regions it could be evaporated from seawater, but inland communities paid dearly for it, and poor-quality salt left meat gray and only partially protected. Spices, when they could be afforded by the wealthy, were not primarily used to hide the taste of going off meat as the old myth suggests. They were status symbols, medicines, and flavor enhancers for already well-preserved dishes. The poor seasoned with mustard, garlic, onions, and the sharp herbs of the garden. Even the architecture of the home reflected this daily negotiation with spoilage. The pantry or buttery was positioned on the north side of the house where the stone walls stayed coolest. Root vegetables were buried in straw-lined pits or stored in cool, dark cellars. Grain was kept in lofts or raised barns. Yet none of these measures could defeat the fundamental truth. Food wanted to return to the earth. It was alive with yeasts and molds and the invisible forces that medieval physicians still described in the language of humors and corruption. This constant pressure shaped more than the menu. It shaped the social order itself. The lord's right to the best cuts, the miller's fee taken in grain, the peasant's obligation to hand over part of the harvest, all existed inside an economy where waste was both feared and inevitable. A bad barrel of salted herring could mean lost wages for a fisherman or a lean Lent for an entire village. A noble household that let its stores spoil through carelessness risked embarrassment and hunger among its retainers. Food security was never guaranteed. It was managed, day after careful day. And yet, within those constraints, people developed an intimate knowledge of their ingredients. They knew that bread baked on a certain day would last longer if the oven had been properly seasoned. They understood that meat smoked over oak tasted better and kept better than meat smoked over pine. They could tell by smell and touch when a cheese was still safe and when it had crossed into the realm of the inedible. This knowledge was passed quietly from mother to daughter, from steward to kitchen boy, forming a practical science of survival that modern industrial food has largely made invisible. As the sun begins to lower over that medieval village, the housewife covers the remaining bread with a clean cloth, checks the seal on the ale barrel, and decides whether tonight's pottage can take the last of the turnips or whether those should be saved for tomorrow. The rhythm continues, unhurried but never relaxed. Tomorrow the cycle begins again. The same vigilance, the same small victories against time and weather, the same quiet understanding that food was never a given. It was something you defended. We will pick up this thread shortly and move deeper into the specific techniques that medieval households used to stretch their supplies through the hardest months. The surprising ways fermentation and drying created entirely new flavors and textures we still crave today, and how this daily struggle quietly influenced everything from medieval medicine to the great trade routes that brought salt and spice into the heart of Europe. For now, the fire is low, the bread is covered, and the long medieval night stretches ahead. As that long medieval night settled over the village, the household turned its quiet attention to the stores that would carry them through until spring. For the real work of preservation had already begun weeks earlier and now demanded steady vigilance rather than dramatic effort. In the half-light of the dying hearth, the housewife might lift the lid on a small wooden tub of cabbage that had been layered with salt and pressed beneath a weighted stone. What had started as fresh leaves from the garden plot was slowly transforming into something tangy and resilient, its sharp scent cutting through the smoky air of the cottage. This was not mere improvisation. It was one of the most reliable weapons in the medieval arsenal against spoilage, a technique known in various forms across Europe as sauerkraut or simply sour cabbage, born from the same microbial dance that could otherwise ruin a harvest in days. The process relied on a subtle understanding of nature's own chemistry, even if medieval minds framed it in terms of balance and corruption rather than bacteria. By shredding the cabbage, salting it generously, and excluding air through tight packing, the natural sugars within the vegetable fed lactic acid bacteria that lowered the pH and created an environment hostile to the molds and pathogens that thrived in damp storage. The result kept for months, sometimes through the entire winter, providing a vital source of vitamin C when fresh greens were impossible to find. Yet the deeper irony, lost on many modern listeners who picture medieval diets as monotonous and bland, was that this necessity produced a flavor profile people actively came to enjoy. The crisp, acidic bite became a welcome contrast to the heavy grains and salted meats that dominated the table. It was not just survival, it was the quiet invention of taste within constraint. Similar transformations happened with turnips, beets, and even beans, each fermented in its own way depending on regional tradition and the availability of salt. Drying offered another patient ally, though it required the right weather and the right timing. Fruits such as apples, pears, and plums were sliced thin and laid out on woven hurdles in the sun or near the hearth during the brief warm spells of late summer and early autumn. The goal was to reduce moisture to a level where decay could not take hold, yet not so low that the fruit became brittle and unpalatable. A well-dried apple ring could last until the following harvest if stored in a cool, dry loft, its concentrated sweetness offering a rare note of pleasure in the darkest months. Herbs from the garden, sage, thyme, rosemary, were bundled and hung to air dry, their essential oils preserving both flavor and medicinal properties. Even fish from the rivers or the coast could be split open, salted lightly, and hung in the wind to become stockfish, a staple that traveled far and kept remarkably well once the initial drying had succeeded. The technique was ancient, practiced since Roman times and refined over centuries, yet it remained vulnerable to sudden rain or a spell of humidity that could undo days of careful work in a single afternoon. Smoking complemented drying in the most practical households, especially for meat and fish. After the autumn slaughter, hams and sides of bacon were rubbed with a mixture of salt, sometimes a little sugar or herbs if the family could spare them, and then suspended high in the chimney or a dedicated smokehouse where a low, smoldering fire of hardwood, preferably oak or beech, released its preserving compounds. The smoke not only dried the surface further, but deposited phenols and other chemicals that inhibited bacterial growth, while imparting that distinctive flavor still prized today. Here again, a common assumption dissolves under closer view. The smoky taste was not an accidental byproduct but a deliberate choice, one that made the preserved meat more appealing and, crucially, distinguished the careful steward from the careless one whose stores developed off flavors or outright rot. A noble household might maintain a larger smokehouse staffed by a dedicated servant, while the peasant family made do with the family hearth, adjusting the fire each evening so that the gentle cure continued without scorching. Salt, of course, remained the great equalizer and the great expense. Without it, most of these methods collapsed. Coastal communities evaporated seawater in shallow pans or gathered it from rock pools, but inland villages depended on trade networks that stretched back to ancient salt mines or the evaporated flats of the Bay of Bourgneuf in France. The cost could consume a significant portion of a household's cash or barter goods, which is why every grain was used sparingly and why poorer families sometimes stretched their supplies with ash or even urine in desperate times. An unromantic detail that reveals the true pressure of the spoilage clock. Once salted, however, pork, beef, or herring could endure for a year or more if the barrel remained sealed and the contents were periodically inspected and resalted as needed. The medieval palate adapted. Heavily salted foods were rinsed before cooking or paired with sharp mustard and vinegar to cut through the brine, creating layered dishes that modern recreations often find surprisingly complex. These techniques did more than extend the life of food. They quietly reshaped the rhythms of the entire year and the social bonds that held communities together. The autumn pig killing, for instance, was not merely practical but communal. Neighbors helped one another, shared labor, and exchanged portions of the fresh meat before the serious curing began. Monasteries, with their larger stores and more stable routines, perfected their own systems. Great wheels of hard cheese aged in cool cellars, ale brewed in quantities that could keep for weeks when properly hopped, and bread baked in vast ovens that retained heat long enough for multiple batches. The Cistercians and Benedictines, in particular, documented these practices in their rules and account books, showing how the daily struggle against decay became a form of spiritual discipline as much as a material necessity. Even the nobility, for all their feasts and apparent abundance, lived under the same shadow. A well-stocked larder was a mark of prudent lordship, and a spoiled shipment from the estates could signal weakness to rivals or discontent among retainers. Yet the limits remained ever-present, and they influenced health in ways that medieval physicians understood only partially. Spoiled food was not always thrown out. Sometimes it was eaten anyway when hunger pressed harder than caution. Physicians spoke of corrupt humors, arising from bad meat or sour milk, linking such consumption to fluxes, fevers, and the mysterious outbreaks that swept through crowded towns. What they could not see was the invisible threshold where fermentation tipped from preservation into danger, where a barrel of ale left too long developed not just sourness but toxins. This uncertainty added another layer of quiet tension to daily life, one that modern refrigeration has largely erased from our collective memory. People learned to trust their senses, smell, taste, the appearance of mold, but those senses could be deceived, especially in winter when lighting was poor and fatigue constant. As we follow this thread deeper into the medieval experience, it becomes clear that the battle against spoilage was never static. It evolved with the seasons, with local resources, and with the slow accumulation of generational knowledge that passed from one fireside to the next. The same pressures that shaped the peasant's larder also drove larger movements in the medieval world, pushing merchants along trade routes in search of better salt, stronger spices, and the exotic preserves that could turn a noble table into a display of power and sophistication. The herring fisheries of the Baltic, the salt pans of the Mediterranean, the spice caravans crossing the Alps. All of these distant endeavors found their quiet origin in the simple need to keep food from returning to the earth too soon. The night deepens further now, the covered bread rests safely for tomorrow, and the fermented cabbage in its tub continues its slow, unseen work. Tomorrow the household will check the drying racks, turn the cheeses in the cellar, and perhaps begin the careful process of rendering fat to seal another barrel against the air. The cycle does not pause, and neither does the deeper story of how these intimate, daily acts of preservation rippled outward to influence the great economic and cultural currents of medieval Europe. The cycle does not pause, and neither does the deeper story of how these intimate, daily acts of preservation rippled outward to influence the great economic and cultural currents of medieval Europe. Those small decisions, checking the drying racks at first light, turning the cheeses to ensure even aging, rendering fat to create an airtight seal, were the invisible foundation upon which larger systems were built. Across Europe, the constant need to combat spoilage fostered networks of trade that connected remote villages to distant ports and markets, turning what seemed like a purely domestic concern into one of the driving forces behind medieval commerce. In the coastal regions of the North Sea and the Baltic, entire economies rose around the preservation of herring, a fish that, when properly salted and barreled, could travel hundreds of miles without turning. Fishermen worked in seasonal fleets during the great shoals of summer and autumn, their catches immediately gutted, layered with salt from the evaporating pans of the Bay of Bourgneuf or the mines of Lüneburg, and packed so tightly that air could scarcely reach the flesh. This was no casual enterprise. A single well-cured barrel could feed a household or a monastery for weeks, and the trade in preserved herring became so vital that it supported the growth of bustling ports, and the powerful merchant associations that would later bind the northern cities together. The salt itself, heavy and expensive to transport overland, moved along river routes and packhorse trails, its price fluctuating with the harvest and the weather in ways that affected every level of society. A poor salt year meant weaker cures, quicker spoilage, and the quiet anxiety of another lean winter. A good one allowed surplus to be sold at market, giving a peasant family a few extra coins or a length of cloth. Inland, the same pressures shaped the weekly rhythm of town markets, where fresh produce and dairy had to be sold or consumed the same day they arrived. Butchers in larger centers operated under strict guild rules that required meat to be inspected for signs of corruption. Yet even these regulations could not fully outpace the flies and the warmth of a summer afternoon. Householders learned to buy only what could be preserved immediately upon returning home, and the market squares themselves became theaters of careful negotiation. The smell of slightly sour ale signaled a bargain to be had, while the sight of mold on cheese might prompt a haggle over price rather than outright rejection. What modern eyes might view as primitive hygiene was, in practice, a finely tuned system of risk assessment, one that relied on experience passed through generations and the shared knowledge of neighbors who had seen barrels burst or grain bins turn black with weevils. This outward reach extended even further when one considers the nobility and the great ecclesiastical estates. A castle's storerooms, often carved into the cool earth beneath the keep, held not only the salted meats and smoked fish of the local harvest, but also imported luxuries that arrived via the same trade routes. Olive oil from the Mediterranean, almonds and figs dried in the sun of southern orchards, and the occasional shipment of eastern spices were valued not merely for flavor but for their superior keeping qualities. Pepper, cloves, and cinnamon, though costly, helped mask any lingering off notes in long-stored dishes and, more importantly, demonstrated the Lord's ability to command resources from afar. The myth that spices were used primarily to conceal rotten meat has long been overstated. In truth, a well-managed household rarely served truly spoiled food to the high table. Instead, these imports served as both practical preservatives in sauces and pottages and as visible proof of status, their presence at a feast reassuring guests that the host had mastered the same daily battle against decay that plagued every cottage. Monasteries, with their ordered routines and extensive lands, often led the way in scaling these techniques. The great Cistercian houses maintained vast fish ponds where carp and pike could be kept alive until needed, then quickly salted or smoked for distribution to dependent villages. Their scriptoria sometimes recorded precise instructions for cheese-making and wine storage, methods refined over decades of trial and quiet observation. During the long seasons of fasting prescribed by the Church, when meat was forbidden for weeks at a time, the reliance on preserved fish, eggs, and dairy became a matter of both spiritual discipline and practical survival. Lent, in particular, tested every larder. A household or abbey that had managed its stores wisely could observe the fast without hardship, while one that had let its barrels leak or its grain dampen faced genuine privation. Here the personal and the communal intertwined once more. The success of preservation was not only about feeding the body but about upholding the rhythm of the liturgical year itself. Yet the very success of these systems carried its own subtle contradictions. The trade routes that carried salt and herring also carried news, ideas, and occasionally the seeds of disruption. Merchants moving between fairs learned which regions produced the hardest cheeses or the most reliable smoked hams, and this knowledge gradually standardized certain techniques across wider areas. At the same time, the concentration of food stores in towns and castles sometimes invited trouble. A well-stocked granary could become a target during times of scarcity, and the fear of spoiled supplies loomed large in the calculations of any lord preparing for siege or campaign. The material limits of preservation, wooden barrels that could split, salt that could clump and lose potency, smoke that could fail if the wood was too resinous, meant that even the most careful planning could be undone by a single wet summer or an early frost that caught the drying fruits still heavy with moisture. As the 13th century drew toward its close, these pressures were already beginning to shift in subtle ways. Population growth in many parts of Europe had increased the demand for preserved foods while straining the land's ability to produce reliable surpluses. The climate, which had been relatively kind during the High Middle Ages, showed the first signs of cooling that would later contribute to the hardships of the following century. In response, households and merchants experimented more boldly. New varieties of hardy grains were sown, salting methods were refined with careful measurements of brine strength, and the use of vinegar and honey as additional barriers against decay became more widespread among those who could afford them. The daily acts in the village cottage remained much the same: checking the racks, turning the wheels of cheese, sealing the barrels, but the stakes felt incrementally higher, the margins for error narrower. Tomorrow, as the household stirs again in that English or French village, the same quiet vigilance will continue. Yet now we can begin to see how those same rhythms were quietly reshaping the wider medieval world. The trade in preserved goods was not merely sustaining life. It was knitting together regions that had once seemed impossibly distant, laying groundwork for economic alliances, cultural exchanges, and the slow accumulation of practical knowledge that would one day help bridge the medieval and the early modern eras. The fire will be rekindled, the drying racks inspected, and the deeper currents of history will flow on, carrying with them the story of how the simplest necessity, keeping food from spoiling too quickly, helped shape the contours of an entire age. The fire will be rekindled, the drying racks inspected, and the deeper currents of history will flow on, carrying with them the story of how the simplest necessity, keeping food from spoiling too quickly, helped shape the contours of an entire age. By the opening decades of the 14th century, those contours were already beginning to tighten in ways that made the daily rituals of preservation feel less like routine and more like a fragile bulwark against forces larger than any single household could control. The climate, which had favored reliable harvests for generations, started its slow turn toward cooler, wetter patterns that historians now recognize as the early stirrings of what would become known as the Little Ice Age. In the village we have been quietly observing, the summers grew shorter and the rains more persistent, turning what should have been crisp drying days into damp ordeals where mold claimed the apple slices before they could fully cure, and where the grain in the raised granary absorbed just enough moisture to invite weevils earlier than usual. This was no sudden catastrophe but a gradual tightening of the spoilage clock, one that compounded the pressures already felt from a Europe grown more populous than at any time since the Roman era. Fields that had once produced reliable surpluses now yielded thinner crops, and the salted pork barrel that might have lasted until Easter in a milder decade now required constant checking for the telltale slick of surface rot. Families responded with the same patient ingenuity they had always shown. They harvested earlier when they could, experimented with heavier salting even when the price of salt climbed, and turned more frequently to the fermentation tub as a last reliable friend. Yet the deeper consequence was felt in the widening gap between what the land could provide and what the larder could hold. A wet harvest meant not only less grain but grain that spoiled faster in storage, forcing millers to grind smaller batches more often and leaving villagers to stretch their pottages with whatever wild greens or roots could still be foraged before the first hard frosts. The Great Famine that struck between 1315 and 1317 brought these quiet vulnerabilities into sharp, unrelenting focus across northern Europe. Torrential rains ruined successive harvests, and the resulting scarcity made every preserved store precious beyond measure. In the cottage, the housewife might now portion out the fermented cabbage with a stricter hand, knowing that a single leaky barrel could mean the difference between endurance and despair. Salted herring from the Baltic, once a dependable Lenten staple, became harder to obtain as trade routes strained under the weight of widespread hunger. Merchants reported barrels arriving with their contents already turning, the brine diluted by rainwater that had seeped through imperfect seals during the long journey. Monasteries opened their granaries to the starving, but even their carefully managed cheeses and smoked fish dwindled faster than anticipated. revealing how the best-laid preservation plans could still be overwhelmed when the weather itself turned enemy. What many modern listeners assume about this period is that famine struck purely because of failed crops. The fuller picture, grounded in the practical realities of the time, shows how spoilage amplified the crisis at every turn. Grain that reached the market already damp and sprouting invited accusations of fraud against merchants, while householders who had stored their own supplies too optimistically watched helplessly as mold spread through sacks that had seemed secure only weeks earlier. Livestock, weakened by the same poor fodder, yielded less milk and poorer meat that cured less reliably, closing yet another loop in the cycle of scarcity. Physicians of the era, still working within the framework of humors and corrupt air, noted the increase in fluxes and wasting diseases that followed the consumption of anything less than perfectly preserved, though they could not yet name the invisible agents at work. The famine passed, as all such visitations eventually do, but it left a lingering caution in the collective memory. The knowledge that even the most diligent housewife or steward could be undone by a run of bad seasons. In the decades that followed, this heightened awareness quietly reshaped trade and technology alike. Merchants in the Hanseatic League refined their barrel-making techniques, using tighter staves and better pitch to protect the precious salted herring and cod that fed the growing towns of the north. Inland salt traders experimented with purer grades, learning through costly trial that the quality of the cure depended as much on the salt's dryness as on its quantity. In the great households, stewards began keeping more meticulous accounts of what entered and left the stores, noting the precise days when a wheel of cheese needed turning or when the smoke in the chimney should be banked lower to avoid overdrying. These were not grand innovations announced in chronicles but small, incremental adjustments born of necessity, the sort of practical evolution that rarely earns mention in grand histories yet quietly sustained the medieval world through its most trying centuries. Even warfare felt the influence of these same constraints. When armies marched, whether for the 100 Years' War that would soon grip England and France or for the smaller campaigns between rival lords, their supply trains had to contend with the same spoilage clock that governed village life. Biscuit baked hard and dry could last for weeks on the march, but only if the wagons remained covered against rain. Salted meat traveled better but grew heavier with every mile, and the need to forage or requisition fresh supplies often slowed an advance or invited ambush. A prudent commander learned to time campaigns around the seasons of preservation, launching in late summer when the new harvest stores were fullest, and avoiding the depths of winter when even the best cured provisions began to fail. The fear of spoiled rations was not merely logistical. It could erode discipline faster than any enemy, turning a well-provisioned force into one weakened by dysentery or discontent. Back in the village, as the 14th century unfolded, these larger currents filtered down into the daily round without fanfare. The housewife still lifted the lid on the cabbage tub each morning, still inspected the drying racks, still judged the color and scent of the bacon hanging in the chimney. Yet now she did so with the memory of recent hardship fresh in her mind, passing on to her daughters not only the techniques but the hard-won sense of how precarious abundance could be. The church bells that once rang mainly for feast days now sometimes tolled for processions seeking divine relief from poor harvests, and the communal sharing of labor during the pig killing took on a more solemn tone, as though every barrel packed represented a small act of defiance against the uncertainties ahead. The story, however, was far from over. As the century wore on, another shadow would fall across Europe that would test these preservation systems in ways even the famine had not prepared them for, reshaping labor, land use, and the very balance between rural cottage and urban market in the process. The deeper currents continued to flow, carrying the quiet knowledge of spoilage and survival forward into a new and profoundly altered age, where the same intimate acts of checking, turning, and sealing would be called upon once more to sustain a world that had been forced to rebuild itself from within. The deeper currents continued to flow, carrying the quiet knowledge of spoilage and survival forward into a new and profoundly altered age, where the same intimate acts of checking, turning, and Sealing would be called upon once more to sustain a world that had been forced to rebuild itself from within. That profound alteration arrived in the middle of the 14th century with a force that no granary wall or smokehouse chimney could hold back. The plague that swept across Europe beginning in 1347, known to later generations as the Black Death. In the village we have followed through its quieter seasons. The first rumors arrived with traveling merchants who spoke of ships from the east carrying not only goods but an unseen sickness that struck with terrifying speed. Within months the cottages emptied, fields lay half-harvested, and the daily rhythms of preservation took on a haunting new urgency amid the sudden absence of hands that had once shared the labor. The immediate effect on food stores was as practical as it was harrowing. With so many villagers fallen ill or gone, the autumn slaughter and curing went unfinished in countless households. Barrels that should have been packed tight with salted pork stood only half-filled, their lids imperfectly sealed and thus more vulnerable to the damp air that crept in during the long nights. Cheese wheels in the cellars went unturned for weeks at a time, developing uneven rinds or soft spots that would have been caught earlier in healthier years. The fermented cabbage tubs, once tended by multiple generations working side by side, now sat neglected in some homes, their protective acidity still working, but without the careful monitoring that had kept them safe through milder times. Yet the deeper irony, one that reveals much about the resilience embedded in medieval preservation knowledge, was that the very techniques designed to outlast seasons now helped the survivors stretch dwindling supplies through the worst months. A single household that remained intact could draw on stores meant for 5 or 6, and the reduced population meant less immediate pressure on the remaining grain and salted fish, even as the fear of contaminated water or spoiled remnants added its own invisible layer of caution. Physicians and chroniclers of the time, still interpreting events through the lens of corrupted air and imbalanced humors, noted how the plague seemed to spare no class or region, yet food itself became both a vector of suspicion and a rare comfort. In the great monasteries, where routines had once been so orderly, the scriptoria recorded desperate measures. Fish ponds drained more frequently because there were fewer monks to tend them, and the smoking fires burned lower to conserve wood when labor for gathering it grew scarce. Urban markets, already strained by the earlier famine decades, now saw even fresher goods vanish almost overnight as butchers and dairy women fell ill. What arrived on the stalls had to be preserved or consumed the same day, and the guilds tightened their inspections not only for quality but for any sign that the food might carry the same unseen corruption that was claiming lives. The spoilage clock, always relentless, now ticked against a backdrop of empty streets and silent church bells, forcing the living to master the old techniques with a new intensity born of necessity. In the countryside, the sudden depopulation brought a paradoxical shift in the balance between people and the land. Fields that had been pushed to their limits during the years of population growth now lay fallow in places, allowing the soil to rest and, in time, produce more reliable harvests once the immediate crisis eased. Survivors found themselves with access to larger plots, more livestock, and, crucially, the preserved stores of those who had not made it through the winter of 1348–49. The salted herring that had once been a modest Lenten staple could now be eaten in greater quantities, and the smokehouses, tended by fewer hands, produced bacon and hams that lasted longer because there were simply fewer mouths to feed. This was not abundance in any celebratory sense. It was a grim reordering in which the quiet arts of drying apples or layering cabbage with salt became acts of quiet stewardship over a world that had been thinned out. Landlords who had once demanded high rents and grain now found themselves accepting lower payments or switching to less labor-intensive sheep farming, whose wool could be traded for imported salt and spices that kept longer than local produce ever could. The plague years also quietly accelerated certain refinements in preservation that had been emerging slowly before the outbreak. With labor scarcer and wages rising for those who remained, households invested more care in better storage solutions. Deeper root pits lined with straw and stone, tighter barrel staves bound by skilled coopers who could now charge more for their work, and the increased use of vinegar derived from soured ale or wine as an additional preservative layer in pottages and sauces. The Hanseatic merchants, operating from the northern ports that had been less devastated in some areas, expanded their trade in high-quality salt and stockfish, filling a gap left by disrupted local production. These changes were not dramatic inventions announced in royal decrees, but the steady accumulation of practical wisdom tested under the harshest conditions. A widow in our village, now managing the cottage alone with her children, might discover that by rendering every scrap of fat from the autumn slaughter and using it to seal the barrel lids more thoroughly, she could extend the life of her stores by precious extra weeks. Knowledge she would pass on not as theory but as the simple difference between endurance and hunger. By the 1360s and 1370s, as the immediate shock of the first wave receded and recurrent outbreaks continued at lower intensity, the medieval world had begun to adjust to its new, smaller scale. The rhythms of the village returned in outline. Bread baked, ale brewed, cheese turned. But the scale and the social meaning had shifted. Feasts that once celebrated a full harvest now carried a more subdued tone, acknowledging the empty places at the table. The church, ever present in daily life, emphasized fasting and moderation with renewed vigor, while the practical science of the larder adapted to the reality that fewer workers meant more reliance on durable, long-keeping foods rather than fresh daily catches. Trade routes, though still vulnerable, grew more efficient in some respects because fewer people competed for the same preserved goods, allowing salt and spices to reach deeper into the countryside than before. The contradiction at the heart of it all was quietly profound. The very catastrophe that had devastated populations had, in its aftermath, given the survivors a slightly wider margin against the spoilage that had once pressed so relentlessly on every household. Yet the deeper currents did not stop here. As the 14th century gave way to the 15th, these adaptations began to intersect with larger movements in technology, commerce, and even the slow stirrings of what historians would later recognize as early modern changes. The same intimate acts, checking the drying racks at dawn, inspecting the cheese in the cool cellar, resealing the barrels with fresh fat, remained the quiet heartbeat of survival, but now they operated within a Europe that was slowly reconnecting its regions and looking outward once more. The knowledge forged in the plague years would travel along those same trade networks that carried the preserved herring and the costly salt, seeding new ideas about storage and seasoning that would prove vital as populations gradually recovered and the demands on the larder grew again. In the village, as another autumn approaches in this altered world, the housewife or her grown daughter still lifts the lid on the cabbage tub, still judges the scent of the smoking chimney, and still plans the winter stores with the hard-won caution of those who have seen the worst that weather and fate can bring. The cycle persists, unhurried yet ever attentive, and the story of how medieval food fought its quiet war against time and decay continues to unfold into the decades ahead, where new pressures and new opportunities would test those same resilient techniques in ways that bridged the medieval age with the ones slowly taking shape beyond it. The cycle persists, unhurried yet ever attentive, and the story of how medieval food fought its quiet war against time and decay continues to unfold into the decades ahead, where new pressures and new opportunities would test those same resilient techniques in ways that bridged the medieval age with the ones slowly taking shape beyond it. As the 15th century dawned, the village and its larder had settled into a rhythm shaped by memory of loss and the slow return of stability. Population numbers, though still far below their pre-plague peaks, were beginning to climb once more, and with that gradual recovery came fresh demands on the land and the stores. Fields that had lain fallow for a generation were brought back under the plow, yielding harvests that felt abundant by comparison with the lean decades. Yet the housewife in our cottage still approached each autumn with the same measured caution, knowing that a single overly wet summer could undo the gains of several good years. The techniques themselves had been quietly refined in the years following the Great Mortality. Coopers in the nearby market town now produced barrels with more precise joints and thicker pitch seals. Lessons learned when labor had been scarce and every container had to last longer. Salt, still costly but more reliably available through the expanding Hanseatic networks, was applied with a slightly heavier hand in many households, allowing the salted pork to endure not just through winter but into the uncertain springs that followed. The drying racks for apples and pears were sometimes elevated on simple wooden frames to catch better airflow, a small adjustment that reduced the risk of mold during those damp spells that had once ruined entire batches. Fermentation remained the steadfast ally. The cabbage tub in the corner of the cottage now often held a larger portion. Its tangy contents stretched further with the addition of caraway seeds or juniper berries when they could be foraged, lending both flavor and an extra layer of preservation through their natural oils. These were not revolutionary changes, but the patient evolution of knowledge born from necessity, passed from one fireside to the next without fanfare. In the towns that had begun to swell again with returning trade, the market squares reflected this same careful balance. Fresh meat and dairy still had to be sold or preserved the same day, but guild regulations now carried the weight of hard-won experience from the plague years, demanding stricter inspection of barrels and stricter penalties for those who allowed goods to turn. Ale brewers experimented with stronger hopping to extend the drink's life, while bakers produced harder, drier biscuits that could be stored for weeks rather than days, useful both for town dwellers and for the small companies of soldiers moving through the countryside during the intermittent conflicts of the age. The nobility, too, adapted their great households to the new realities. Castle larders were stocked with a wider variety of imported preserves, dried fruits from the Mediterranean, barrels of olive oil that kept almost indefinitely when sealed properly, and the occasional luxury of sugar from distant cane fields, used sparingly not only for sweetness but as a preservative in fruit conserves that could last through the year. What strikes the modern listener as most layered about this period is how the very recovery from catastrophe created its own subtle contradictions. More people meant more mouths to feed, and the push to cultivate marginal lands once again increased the chance of disappointing harvests that spoiled faster in storage. At the same time, the reduced pressure on wages had given many peasant families a slightly larger share of their own produce, allowing them to invest in better tools or a sturdier outbuilding for the granary. The church, ever influential, continued to frame these labors within the liturgical calendar, with saints' days marking the proper times for slaughter or drying. Yet behind the ritual lay the practical calculation that a well-timed cure could mean the difference between a comfortable Lent and one marked by thin pottages and anxious evenings. Physicians, still guided by humoral theory, advised on the dangers of corrupt foods with greater urgency after the plague, encouraging the use of vinegar washes and thorough cooking even for preserved items, advice that aligned remarkably well with the observable realities of spoilage even if the underlying explanations differed. Across the Channel and deeper into the continent, these same pressures and adaptations played out with regional variations that enriched the overall picture. In the Low Countries, where land was reclaimed from the sea and population density remained high, the curing of herring reached new levels of efficiency, with fleets returning to ports that had recovered faster than many inland areas. The smoked and salted catches fed not only local tables but were shipped inland along rivers and canals, their reliable keeping qualities making them a staple that could outlast the uncertainties of overland grain transport. In Italy and the Mediterranean fringes of the medieval world, the warmer, drier climate allowed for techniques that northern households could only envy. Sun-drying of figs and grapes into long-keeping pastes, the use of olive oil as both flavor and barrier against air, and the storage of cheeses in cool caves that maintained an even temperature year-round. These regional differences were not isolated. They traveled along the same trade routes that carried salt and spices, gradually influencing practices even in the cooler, wetter north through the accounts of merchants and the occasional traveling cook. The quiet war against decay also shaped the social fabric in ways that extended beyond the kitchen hearth. Manorial records from the 15th century show stewards keeping ever more detailed tallies of what entered the stores and what emerged months later, noting losses to mold or rodents with the same precision once reserved for rents and tithes. This growing emphasis on careful accounting reflected a broader shift toward a more commercial outlook, where surplus preserved food could be sold at market for coin rather than simply hoarded against hunger. For the peasant family, that extra barrel of salted fish or wheel of aged cheese might mean the difference between paying a fine or negotiating a better lease. For the lord, it meant the ability to provision retainers without draining the treasury. The contradiction here was gentle but persistent. The very techniques that had sustained life through the darkest years now quietly fueled the engines of recovery and modest prosperity. As the century progressed toward its middle decades, the rhythms in the village remained outwardly familiar. The bread baked weekly, the ale brewed monthly, the pork cured each autumn. Yet beneath them ran deeper currents of change. The introduction of new crop rotations in some regions improved soil fertility and reduced the risk of damp-stored grain, while the slow spread of water-powered mills allowed flour to be ground more efficiently and, in some cases, stored with less exposure to the elements. Trade in exotic goods, though still limited to those who could afford them, brought small quantities of nutmeg or ginger that could be added to preserves for both flavor and their reputed preservative qualities. The household in our English or French village might not taste these luxuries often, but the knowledge of their existence filtered down through market gossip and the occasional peddler's tale, reminding everyone that the battle against spoilage was part of a larger world that stretched far beyond the cottage walls. The fire in the hearth is banked low once more as another evening settles, and the covered bread rests beside the tub of fermenting cabbage, whose slow transformation will carry the family further into the season. Tomorrow the drying racks will be checked again, the smoke adjusted in the chimney, and the careful planning for the coming months will continue in the same unhurried yet attentive manner. The story, however, is still unfolding, for as the 15th century moves forward, new opportunities and new pressures, born of recovering populations, expanding commerce, and the first tentative explorations beyond Europe's shores, will begin to test and transform these same resilient techniques in ways that quietly prepare the ground for the changes that lie just over the horizon of the medieval world. The story, however, is still unfolding, for as the 15th century moves forward, new opportunities and new pressures born of recovering populations, expanding commerce, and the first tentative explorations beyond Europe's shores, will begin to test and transform these same resilient techniques in ways that quietly prepare the ground for the changes that lie just over the horizon of the medieval world. In the villages and market towns of this later period, the effects appeared first as a gentle but steady quickening of the old rhythms. Population growth, though modest compared with the high medieval centuries, once again filled more cottages and swelled the lanes of regional fairs, placing fresh demands on the larders that had been managed with such hard-won care since the plague years. The housewife in our familiar English or French village now found herself planning for 1 or 2 extra mouths at the table, which meant larger batches of fermented cabbage, more careful layering of salt in the pork barrels, and a sharper eye on the drying racks to ensure every slice of apple or pear contributed its full weight to the winter stores. Expanding commerce brought both relief and new complexities to this daily vigilance. The Hanseatic League and the growing merchant companies of the Low Countries and northern Italy moved greater quantities of high-quality salt along established river routes and coastal shipping lanes, making the preservative more accessible even to middling households. Barrels arriving from the Baltic carried not only herring but the accumulated expertise of fishermen who had refined their curing methods over generations, producing stockfish so thoroughly dried that it could survive weeks in a ship's hold without turning. These imports allowed local stewards and housewives to experiment with lighter salting for some meats, reserving the heavier cures for items that needed to travel farther to market. Yet the very increase in trade introduced its own subtle risks. Longer journeys meant more exposure to damp sea air or sudden temperature shifts in warehouses, and a barrel that left the curing sheds in perfect condition could arrive weeks later with a faint bloom of mold if the cooper's seals had not held or if the ship had encountered storms. Merchants learned to inspect cargoes with the same practiced senses once reserved for household pantries, tasting a sliver of bacon or sniffing the headspace of an ale cask to judge whether the contents had survived the voyage intact. In the larger towns, where urban populations were rebounding more visibly, the professionalization of food trades added another layer to the story of preservation. Guilds of salters, brewers, and bakers operated under charters that mandated precise standards for keeping quality, reflecting the understanding that a town's health depended as much on reliable stores as on fresh daily supplies. A baker in a prosperous market center might now produce batches of twice-baked ship's biscuit, hard, dry rounds that kept for months and were increasingly carried by merchants traveling between fairs or by the small garrisons maintaining order along trade roads. Ale houses experimented with stronger brews laced with more hops, extending the drink's life from days to weeks and reducing the frequency with which barrels needed to be refilled and thus exposed to air. Even dairy, the most perishable of staples, found new pathways through the growing network of town dairy women who churned butter in cooler cellars and packed it in salted layers for short-distance sale, a technique that allowed small surpluses to reach markets that had once relied solely on whatever the local cows produced that morning. The first tentative explorations beyond Europe's shores, though still distant in their full impact, began to echo back into these domestic practices in unexpected ways. As Portuguese and Spanish navigators pushed down the African coast and across the Atlantic in search of new routes to the Spice Islands, the provisioning of their ships demanded preservation methods that could withstand weeks or months at sea. Salted beef and pork, hardtack, and dried peas became the backbone of these voyages. Techniques borrowed and refined from the very traditions that had sustained medieval households and armies for centuries. News of these expeditions filtered back through port towns and merchant letters, carrying stories of how a well-cured barrel could mean the difference between reaching a distant harbor or turning back in hunger. In the villages of Northern Europe, this translated into a quiet curiosity about stronger cures and longer-keeping foods, even if the exotic spices themselves remained rare and costly. A pinch of imported ginger or cloves, when it could be afforded, might be added to a pot of preserving vinegar not merely for flavor, but because word had spread that such additions helped keep sauces from turning during the warmer months. These developments carried their own gentle contradictions, as so many aspects of medieval life had before. The recovery of population and the expansion of trade created more reliable supplies in good years, yet they also heightened the stakes when a poor harvest or a disrupted shipment arrived. A single delayed salt caravan from the Mediterranean could leave inland markets short, forcing households to rely more heavily on fermentation and smoking at precisely the moment when labor was stretched thinner by the demands of larger families and busier fields. The nobility and ecclesiastical estates, meanwhile, used their greater resources to stockpile imported preserves, almonds and raisins packed in honey, olive oil shipped in earthenware jars sealed with wax, and the occasional luxury of cane sugar that could transform fruit into conserves capable of lasting an entire year. These displays of abundance at the high table still served the old purpose of demonstrating mastery over the spoilage clock, but now they also signaled participation in a wider commercial world that stretched toward horizons previously unimagined. Throughout the countryside, the old intimate knowledge endured, passed down as it always had been. The turning of cheeses in the cool cellar, the careful adjustment of the smoke in the chimney, the daily check on the cabbage tub, these acts remained the quiet center of survival. Yet the scale had shifted subtly. What had once been the concern of a single household or manor was increasingly linked to distant ports and the decisions of merchants whose ships might be weeks from home. The material limits that had defined medieval food for so long, wooden barrels, stone cellars, the absence of mechanical cold, were still firmly in place, but the networks that moved goods within those limits had grown more intricate, more interdependent. A wet summer in the Baltic could now affect the price of herring on a French market square, while a successful voyage to the Canary Islands might eventually bring new drying techniques or hardier crop varieties back to European fields. As the century drew toward its close, the village we have followed through its long seasons stood on the cusp of these accumulating changes. The housewife still rose early to inspect the drying racks and judge the scent rising from the chimney, but her calculations now included the possibility of purchasing a small sack of imported salt at the next fair or trading a wheel of her own aged cheese for a barrel of stockfish brought down from the northern ports. The fire in the hearth continued to serve its dual purpose of warmth and gentle curing, and the covered bread rested beside the tub of fermenting cabbage whose slow, unseen work would help carry the family into the uncertain months ahead. The deeper currents of commerce and exploration were beginning to stir the waters around these familiar routines, testing the resilience of techniques that had endured famine, plague, and the slow turning of centuries. Tomorrow the cycle will continue in much the same way it has for generations, yet with the quiet awareness that new pressures and new opportunities are already reshaping the world beyond the cottage walls. The story of why medieval food spoiled so quickly, and how people met that daily challenge with such patient ingenuity, is still moving forward into an age where the old methods would be called upon to sustain voyages of discovery and the gradual transformation of European society itself. The larder remains the quiet heart of the household, and the battle against decay continues, unhurried but ever attentive, as the 15th century prepares to hand its hard-won knowledge to the decades that lie just ahead. The larder remains the quiet heart of the household, and the battle against decay continues, unhurried but ever attentive, as the 15th century prepares to hand its hard-won knowledge to the decades that lie just ahead. In the closing years of that century, the familiar routines in our English or French village took on a faint new undertone carried by news from the ports. Word spread slowly along trade roads and through market gossip of ships setting sail from Spain and Portugal under royal banners, venturing farther down the African coast and, by 1492, across an ocean previously unknown to European charts. These voyages were not yet the stuff of everyday conversation in the cottage, yet they quietly depended on the very preservation techniques that had sustained medieval life for centuries. The barrels of salted pork, the hard-baked biscuit, the dried peas and stockfish loaded aboard those vessels were prepared in the same manner as the stores hanging in the village chimney or packed into the cool cellar. Methods refined through famine and plague, now pressed into service for journeys that could last months without resupply. The provisioning of these expeditions revealed both the strength and the stubborn limits of medieval preservation. Captains and ship stewards relied on the same salting, drying, and smoking that housewives had practiced for generations, because nothing more reliable existed. Salted meat and fish formed the core of the diet at sea, their brine strong enough to withstand the constant motion and damp air of the hold, though barrels still required regular inspection for leaks or the telltale slick of surface corruption. Hardtack, baked twice until it reached a brick-like dryness, could endure the voyage if kept away from seawater, offering a dependable if monotonous staple that echoed the twice-baked breads sometimes produced in larger town bakeries for overland traders. The same fermentation knowledge that turned cabbage into a winter companion was adapted for shipboard use in small quantities of pickled vegetables or verjuice, helping to ward off the scurvy that plagued crews when fresh stores ran low. Yet the deeper irony lay in how these ancient techniques, so effective on land, met their match in the unpredictable conditions of long ocean passages. Heat from the tropics could accelerate spoilage even in well-cured barrels, while the rolling of the ship sometimes cracked seals that had held firm in a quiet cellar. Back on European soil, the early returns from these voyages began to trickle into the continent's larders in subtle ways. Small quantities of new plants and goods found their way first to Iberian ports and then northward through established trade networks. Maize, brought from the Caribbean islands, arrived in modest sacks and was initially treated much like other grains, dried thoroughly and stored in granaries where it could last through the winter if kept free of dampness, though its higher oil content made it slightly more prone to rancidity than traditional wheat or rye. Early experimenters in Spain and Portugal found it could be ground into meal and baked into breads or pottages that kept reasonably well, adding a new resilience to stores in regions where old grains had sometimes failed. Other introductions, such as certain beans and squashes, were dried or pickled using the familiar methods, their novelty lying less in how they were preserved than in the variety they brought to tables that had long relied on a narrower circle of hardy roots and leaves. These early arrivals did not yet transform the daily struggle against spoilage. They simply expanded the range of ingredients that could be coaxed into longer life through salt, smoke, or careful drying. The expanding commerce that accompanied these explorations also reinforced older trade in essentials like salt and spices. Merchants returning from distant coasts sometimes carried purer grades of salt or exotic flavorings that, when used sparingly, enhanced the keeping qualities of sauces and conserves. A household fortunate enough to obtain a small measure of these imports might discover that a pinch added to a vinegar pickle or a honey preserve extended its safe period by weeks, not through magic but through the same antimicrobial properties that medieval cooks had long observed in mustard seeds or garlic. Yet the fundamental reasons food still spoiled so quickly remained unchanged. Without any means of mechanical cooling, without airtight containers beyond waxed wood or glazed pottery, and without chemical additives beyond what nature and fire could provide, every new ingredient still faced the same invisible clock of moisture, warmth, and time. The larder in our village cottage might now hold a small sack of maize alongside the familiar turnips, but the housewife still checked it daily for signs of weevils or damp, just as she had with the old grains. As the 16th century opened, these quiet introductions began to intersect with broader shifts within Europe itself. The growing use of the printing press allowed recipe collections and household manuals to circulate more widely than handwritten manuscripts ever had, spreading practical knowledge of preservation from one region to another. A cook in a noble household might read of Italian methods for conserving fruits in sugar or of German techniques for smoking larger quantities of fish, adapting them to local conditions with the same patient trial and error that had always characterized the craft. Monasteries and great estates, still important centers of storage, experimented with slightly larger stillhouses, purpose-built drying chambers where gentle heat from a low fire could finish the curing of herbs and fruits even in damp northern summers. These refinements were incremental, born of the same attentiveness that had carried households through earlier centuries, yet they carried the subtle promise of greater reliability for those who could afford the extra labor or fuel. In the countryside, the rhythms persisted with familiar steadiness. The autumn slaughter still filled the barrels, the cheeses still turned in the cellar, and the cabbage tub continued its slow, lactic transformation under its weighted stone. But now the calculations sometimes included the possibility of trading surplus smoked ham for a barrel of dried maize or experimenting with a new variety of bean that arrived from a merchant who had dealings in southern ports. The social fabric around these practices evolved as well. Market towns saw a modest increase in specialized vendors offering preserved goods suited to longer travel, while rural families shared knowledge of which new crops stored best alongside the old. The contradiction remained gently persistent. Greater variety and wider trade offered more options against hunger, yet the absence of any true breakthrough in preservation meant that a poor season or a delayed shipment could still turn abundance into scarcity almost overnight. The deeper currents of exploration and commerce were beginning to reshape the medieval world in ways that would one day lead beyond it. Yet the intimate battle in the larder stayed grounded in the same material realities that had defined it for hundreds of years. Ships continued to sail with holds filled by the old techniques, and households continued to defend their stores with the same quiet vigilance. As another generation in the village takes up the daily tasks, lifting the lid on the fermentation tub, adjusting the smoke in the chimney, inspecting the drying racks for the first signs of mold, the knowledge passed forward carries both the weight of centuries and the faint stirrings of a wider world pressing in from the horizon. The story of why food spoiled so quickly, and how people met that challenge with such enduring ingenuity, moves onward into this new century, where the same resilient methods will be tested by larger populations, shifting climates, and the gradual integration of ingredients that had once seemed impossibly distant. The fire remains banked for the night, the covered bread rests safely, and tomorrow the cycle will resume once more, carrying the quiet war against decay into uncharted seasons ahead. The fire remains banked for the night, the covered bread rests safely, and tomorrow the cycle will resume once more, carrying the quiet war against decay into uncharted seasons ahead. In that village cottage, as the 16th century unfolded, the morning light revealed the same familiar tasks. Yet the stores in the larder now occasionally included small quantities of unfamiliar ingredients that had made their way northward from southern ports through the expanding web of merchant ships and overland caravans. Maize, brought back from distant lands across the ocean, had begun appearing in modest plots in some regions of Europe, particularly in the warmer south and gradually in experimental fields farther north. It was treated much like rye or barley, dried on the stalk if possible, or threshed and stored in the raised granary where careful ventilation could keep it from absorbing the damp that still plagued so many harvests. The housewife learned through quiet trial that this new grain, while hardy and productive in good seasons, carried a higher natural oil content than traditional cereals, making it slightly more prone to turning rancid if not kept exceptionally dry or if the weather lingered too long on the wet side. A single damp spell could invite mold faster than with wheat, requiring more frequent turning of the sacks and sometimes the addition of dried herbs whose sharp oils offered a modest extra defense. These introductions arrived alongside the lingering grip of cooler, wetter patterns that had been tightening their hold on the continent since the late medieval centuries. The Little Ice Age, as later observers would name it, brought shorter growing seasons and more unpredictable summers, turning what might once have been reliable drying days into anxious periods of constant vigilance. In the village, the autumn slaughter still filled the barrels, but the meat sometimes needed heavier salting to compensate for the longer, colder winters that slowed curing yet also encouraged condensation inside the larder. Grain that had once lasted comfortably through spring now showed signs of weevils or sprouting earlier, and the fermented cabbage in its tub became even more vital as a reliable source of sharpness and nourishment when fresh roots rotted in the storage pits. The practical knowledge passed down through generations proved its worth here, for the same lactic fermentation that had preserved vegetables for centuries continued to work its quiet magic even when the weather conspired against other methods. Yet the deeper pressure was felt in the social fabric. Poorer harvests meant tighter margins, and the fear of spoiled stores weighed heavier on households already stretched by rising populations and the shifting demands of landlords who sought more efficient ways to extract rents in kind or coin. The religious upheavals of the Reformation added another layer of complexity to these long-standing rhythms. In regions where monasteries and abbeys had once served as centers of large-scale preservation, brewing vast quantities of ale that kept for weeks when properly hopped, aging great wheels of cheese in cool cellars, and maintaining fish ponds stocked for fasting seasons. The dissolution of these institutions in places like England left gaps that local households and town guilds had to fill. The knowledge accumulated in monastic scriptoria and kitchens did not vanish overnight. Much of it passed into the hands of lay stewards or was shared through the growing circulation of printed household manuals that began appearing in the early decades of the century. These books, modest in their ambitions yet revolutionary in their reach, offered precise instructions for salting meats, drying fruits, and layering cabbage with salt and spices, spreading techniques that had once been guarded within cloistered walls to a wider audience of literate housewives and smallholders. A family that had previously relied on the abbey's surplus cheese might now experiment with smaller batches in their own buttery, adjusting the salt and smoke according to the advice newly available in affordable pamphlets. The change was not always seamless. In Protestant areas, the relaxation of strict fasting rules around dairy and butter during Lent meant less pressure on fish preservation but opened new possibilities for using milk and cream in ways that required careful handling to avoid quick souring in the warmer months. Trade continued to knit these local adaptations into a broader tapestry. Ships returning from the New World or the spice routes brought not only maize but occasional barrels of other novel plants. Beans that could be dried and stored alongside the old peas, squashes that lent themselves to pickling in vinegar, and early mentions of roots that would later become known as potatoes, though their full integration into northern diets remained decades away. These newcomers were preserved using the same trusted arsenal. Thorough drying in the sun or near the hearth, packing in salt or brine, or fermenting in the cool shade of the cellar. The twist here, subtle yet persistent, was that the very abundance promised by these crops sometimes complicated the old battle against spoilage. Maize, for instance, could be ground into meal for quick breads that fed more mouths in lean times, but that same meal absorbed moisture readily if the granary roof leaked even slightly, inviting the invisible forces of decay that no amount of vigilance could entirely defeat. Merchants in the ports learned to inspect their cargoes with heightened care, knowing that a barrel of dried beans ruined by seawater during the crossing could mean lost profits and disappointed buyers farther inland. In the towns, where populations were once again swelling, the market squares reflected this evolving balance between tradition and adaptation. Butchers and dairy women operated under guild rules that echoed the medieval emphasis on freshness. Yet now they sometimes offered small quantities of preserved New World goods alongside the familiar salted herring and smoked bacon. Ale brewers, freed in some regions from ecclesiastical oversight, experimented with stronger hops to extend shelf life, while bakers produced harder biscuits suited not only for local tables but for the growing number of traders and soldiers whose routes carried them farther afield. The nobility and wealthier merchants, always one step ahead in access to luxuries, incorporated the occasional exotic preserve, dried fruits candied in sugar or oils from southern groves, into their grand larders, using them as much for display as for practical endurance. Yet even here the material limits remained unchanged. Wooden barrels could still split, cellars could still grow damp, and the absence of any true cold storage meant that every item carried its own quiet clock of vulnerability. The village cottage, however, remained the steady center of this story. The housewife still rose with the dawn to check the drying racks, turn the cheeses, and lift the lid on the cabbage tub whose tangy scent reassured her that at least one part of the larder would hold through the coming weeks. Her children learned the same lessons by her side, judging the color of smoked meat or the firmness of a root vegetable buried in sand, skills that bound them to the generations before them even as the wider world shifted around the cottage walls. The Reformation's ripples and the slow arrival of new crops had altered the texture of daily life without erasing the fundamental challenge. Food still wanted to return to the earth, and only constant, patient attention kept it at bay. As the century progressed into its middle decades, these same pressures and adaptations would intersect with further changes. Population growth that strained the land anew, conflicts that disrupted trade routes, and the gradual spread of ideas about agriculture that would one day reshape entire landscapes. The quiet war against decay continued unabated, its front lines still drawn inside the larder and the granary, where tomorrow's tasks awaited with the same unhurried insistence. The quiet war against decay continued unabated, its front lines still drawn inside the larder and the granary, where tomorrow's tasks awaited with the same unhurried insistence. As the 16th century progressed into its later decades, the village experienced the cumulative weight of these intersecting changes. Population continued to recover, putting renewed pressure on the land and the stores, while the cooler climate of the Little Ice Age brought more frequent poor harvests that tested the limits of even the most careful preservation. In the cottage, the housewife now managed a slightly larger household, her stores including not only the traditional grains and salted meats but also small patches of maize in the garden plot, which she dried and stored with extra caution because of its tendency to absorb moisture more readily than the old wheats. The fermented cabbage remained a reliable staple, its sharp tang a welcome contrast to the heavier pottages, and the smoked bacon in the chimney was inspected more frequently during the damp spells that had become more common. These cooler, wetter years amplified the old vulnerabilities in ways that felt both familiar and newly insistent. Grain harvested in a marginal summer might enter the raised granary with just enough residual dampness to invite weevils by midwinter, forcing the family to sift and redry smaller portions on mild days when the hearth could be coaxed into gentle heat without scorching. Root vegetables buried in sand-lined pits sometimes developed soft spots earlier than expected, and the salted pork barrels required periodic opening and resalting if condensation formed on the inside of the lids. The practical knowledge that had carried households through earlier centuries proved its quiet endurance here. The lactic fermentation in the cabbage tub continued to lower acidity and inhibit unwanted microbes, even when other methods faltered, while the smoke from hardwood in the chimney deposited its protective compounds with the same patient reliability. Yet the deeper irony was that the very resilience of these techniques sometimes masked the growing strain. A family that managed to keep its stores intact through a hard winter might appear prosperous to outsiders. Yet the constant vigilance exacted its own toll, hours spent turning cheeses, checking seals, and judging scents by candlelight that could have gone to other labors in milder times. Printed household manuals, circulating more widely now in both Protestant and Catholic regions, offered a new layer of guidance without replacing the hands-on wisdom of the fireside. A neighbor might share a page describing how to strengthen a brine with a handful of mustard seeds or how to layer dried apples with bay leaves for better keeping, ideas drawn from Italian or German practices that had traveled through trade and print. These books encouraged greater standardization, precise measurements of salt by weight rather than handfuls, or notes on the ideal dryness of grain before storage. Yet they also underscored the unchanging material realities. No manual could alter the fact that wooden barrels still swelled or split with temperature shifts, or that the absence of airtight metal or glass meant air and moisture would always find their way in. The manuals simply made the old battle more deliberate, turning what had once been purely oral tradition into something that could be consulted, compared, and quietly improved upon across villages and towns. In regions touched by the religious conflicts of the age, the disruption of supply lines added another dimension to the spoilage clock. Armies on the march, whether in the French wars of religion or the earlier campaigns in the Low Countries, relied on the same salted meats, hard biscuits, and dried peas that had provisioned medieval hosts centuries before. A well-cured barrel could sustain a company for weeks, but the jostling of wagons over rutted roads or exposure to sudden rains often compromised seals that had held firm in a quiet cellar. Peasants caught between conflicting forces sometimes buried their stores in hidden pits to protect them from requisition or looting, only to retrieve dampened grain or meat that had begun its quiet return to the earth. Monasteries that survived the upheavals continued their ordered preservation on a reduced scale, their cellars still cool and their fish ponds maintained where possible, yet the flow of surplus to surrounding villages grew thinner. The result was a heightened awareness among ordinary households of how interconnected their larders had become with distant events. A poor salt shipment from the Baltic coasts, delayed by blockade or storm, could force heavier reliance on local fermentation and smoking at precisely the moment when labor was diverted to defense or repair. Urban markets reflected these same pressures with a sharper edge. In growing towns, guild regulations tightened around the inspection of preserved goods, requiring butchers to demonstrate that their salted meats showed no signs of graying or sliminess before sale. Dairy women churned butter in cooler underground rooms and packed it in layers of salt for short journeys to market, knowing that even a few hours in summer warmth could turn it rancid. Brewers, now often operating as independent tradesmen rather than monastic suppliers, adjusted their hopping rates to extend the life of ale from days to several weeks, a small but meaningful adaptation that reduced waste in an era when every barrel counted. The arrival of new crops from distant continents continued to filter northward in modest quantities. Beans that could be dried and stored with the old peas, or early varieties of roots that lent themselves to pickling, but each newcomer carried its own subtle requirements. Maize meal, for instance, baked into quick breads that fed more mouths in lean times, yet it demanded drier storage conditions than rye, and households learned through quiet experiment which combinations of salt and herbs best protected the surplus. The nobility and wealthier merchants, with access to larger cellars and imported luxuries, maintained their larders as displays of prudent management as much as of status. Olive oil shipped in sealed jars remained a near-permanent staple, its own natural properties forming a barrier against air, while small quantities of cane sugar allowed for fruit conserves that could endure a full year when properly boiled and sealed with wax. These refinements, however, only highlighted the contrast with the village cottage, where the same fundamental constraints, wood, stone, fire, and salt, governed every decision. The contradiction remained gently persistent. Greater trade and printed knowledge offered more tools, yet the invisible forces of decay operated with the same relentless patience they had shown in the 13th century. A wet summer still turned grain black with mold. Flies still found their way to improperly hung meat, and the calendar of slaughter, drying, and fermentation still dictated the household's year more firmly than any royal decree or religious reform. As the century drew toward its close, the rhythms in the village continued with the same unhurried steadiness that had defined them for generations. The housewife still lifted the lid on the cabbage tub each morning, still judged the firmness of the cheeses in the cellar, and still planned the winter stores with the accumulated caution of those who had seen good years turn lean without warning. Her children absorbed the lessons by example, learning to recognize the faint bloom on bacon or the telltale scent that signaled a barrel needed resealing. The deeper currents of exploration, religious change, and climatic shift had altered the texture of daily life without erasing the core challenge. Food still spoiled quickly because the world offered no easy way to halt the natural processes of moisture, warmth, and time. The quiet war remained a daily negotiation, its front lines as intimate as the larder shelves and as vast as the trade routes that supplied the salt and the occasional exotic addition. Tomorrow the fire will be rekindled, the drying racks checked once more, and the cycle will resume in the granary where new sacks of grain wait beside the familiar turnips and the small reserve of maize. The story of why medieval food spoiled so quickly, and how people met that challenge with such enduring ingenuity, flows onward into the closing years of the century and the uncertain decades beyond, where further population growth, shifting trade patterns, and the slow accumulation of practical knowledge would continue to test and quietly reshape those same resilient techniques in the face of an ever-changing world. In the closing years of the 16th century, as further population growth and shifting trade patterns tested those resilient techniques, the village cottage remained the steadfast center of the quiet struggle, its larder still governed by the same material realities that had defined medieval life for centuries. The housewife, now overseeing a household swelled by another generation, rose each morning to the same round of inspections, lifting the lid on the cabbage tub to gauge the steady progress of its lactic fermentation, turning the cheeses in the cool north-facing cellar to prevent uneven rinds, and checking the drying racks where slices of apple and the occasional new root vegetable waited for the right combination of sun and breeze. Maize had become a more familiar sight in the garden plots of some families, its dried kernels stored alongside rye in the raised granary. Yet it demanded extra vigilance because its higher oil content invited rancidity sooner if a damp autumn lingered. The salted pork barrels, filled after the autumn slaughter, still required periodic resealing with rendered fat, and the smoke from the chimney was adjusted with the same practiced eye to ensure the bacon cured evenly without scorching in the cooler, more unpredictable air of the Little Ice Age. These climatic patterns, with their shorter summers and persistent rains, continued to tighten the spoilage clock in ways that felt both familiar and newly insistent. A harvest that might once have filled the granary to overflowing now often arrived with just enough moisture to encourage mold by midwinter, forcing the family to sift smaller batches on clearer days and spread them near the hearth for a final, gentle drying. Root vegetables buried in straw-lined pits sometimes softened earlier than expected, their skins turning slick where condensation gathered against the earthen walls. Even the fermented cabbage, reliable as ever, took on added importance as a source of sharpness and nourishment, when fresh greens failed and stored turnips developed the faint musty scent that signaled the beginning of their return to the earth. The practical ingenuity that had carried households through famine and plague still served them well. The same techniques of salting, smoking, and layering with protective herbs worked as they always had. Yet the deeper truth was that each successful winter now felt like a small, hard-won victory against margins that had grown narrower with more mouths to feed. Printed manuals, now more common even in rural homes, offered guidance that supplemented rather than replaced the oral wisdom of the fireside. A neighbor might lend a well-thumbed page describing how to strengthen a brine with juniper berries or how to store dried maize meal in layers of salt to extend its safe period. Ideas drawn from practices that had traveled northward through trade and the slow diffusion of knowledge. These books encouraged greater precision, notes on weighing salt rather than measuring by handful, or timing the smoking of meat according to the dryness of the wood. Yet they could not alter the fundamental constraints of wooden barrels that still swelled or split with temperature changes, or of cellars that remained vulnerable to the damp air seeping through stone. The manuals simply made the old battle more deliberate, turning generational instinct into something that could be consulted by candlelight and quietly refined across villages that had once relied solely on memory and example. In regions still touched by the echoes of religious and political instability, the disruption of supply lines added its own quiet pressure. Salt from the Baltic or the Mediterranean coasts sometimes arrived later than expected, delayed by blockades or storms, forcing households to stretch their existing cures or rely more heavily on fermentation and vinegar washes derived from soured ale. Armies moving through the countryside, even in smaller numbers than in earlier decades, requisitioned stores with the same urgency that medieval forces had shown, leaving behind emptied granaries or barrels whose imperfect seals had been compromised by rough transport. Peasants who had hidden their salted fish or smoked hams in concealed pits sometimes retrieved them weeks later only to find the contents slick with moisture or touched by the first bloom of mold, a reminder that no hiding place could fully outpace the invisible processes at work. Monasteries that had endured the Reformation's changes continued their scaled-down preservation where possible, their cool cellars still offering a model of orderly storage. Yet the surplus that once flowed to surrounding villages had grown thinner, pushing ordinary families to master the same arts on a more modest scale. Urban markets in the growing towns reflected these same tensions with sharper precision. Guilds maintained their inspections of salted meats and cheeses, demanding that barrels show no signs of graying or sliminess before sale, while dairy women packed butter in salted layers for the short journey from cooler cellars to the stalls. Brewers adjusted their recipes with stronger hops to give ale a longer life, reducing the frequency with which fresh batches needed to be exposed to air, and bakers produced harder biscuits suited for the increasing numbers of merchants and soldiers whose routes now stretched farther across a continent still linked by the old trade networks. The slow arrival of additional crops from distant continents, early varieties of potatoes beginning to appear in some southern fields and gradually filtering northward, added new possibilities without immediately solving old problems. These tubers, when dried or stored in sand, could last through the winter in good conditions, yet they too absorbed moisture readily and required the same careful placement in the root pit or loft to avoid the soft rot that had claimed turnips for generations. The nobility and wealthier merchants, with their larger cellars and access to imported goods, maintained larders that still served as quiet demonstrations of prudent mastery. Olive oil in sealed jars remained almost permanent, its natural barrier against air as effective as ever, while small quantities of sugar allowed for fruit conserves that could endure months when properly boiled and sealed. These refinements highlighted the contrast with the village cottage, where the same wooden barrels, stone walls, and hearth fires governed every decision, and where a single leaky lid or a forgotten turning of the cheese could mean the difference between sustenance and scarcity. The gentle contradiction persisted. Wider trade and printed knowledge brought more options, yet the material world offered no escape from the relentless work of moisture, warmth, and time. A wet summer still turned grain black with mold. Flies still found their way to meat hung too low, and the calendar of slaughter, drying, and fermentation still dictated the household's year more firmly than any distant royal edict or market fluctuation. As the 16th century gave way to the 17th, the rhythms in the village continued with the same unhurried steadiness that had defined them across the medieval centuries. The housewife still inspected the drying racks at first light, still judged the scent rising from the chimney, and still planned the winter stores with the accumulated caution of those who had seen abundance turn to want without warning. Her children learned the same lessons by her side, recognizing the faint bloom on bacon or the telltale softness in a stored root, skills that bound them to the generations before, even as the wider world of exploration and commerce pressed closer. The deeper currents of population recovery, climatic challenge, and the gradual integration of new crops had altered the texture of daily life without erasing the core reality. Food still spoiled so quickly because the world had yet to offer any true means of halting the natural processes that had shaped European larders since the early Middle Ages. Tomorrow the fire will be rekindled once more, the cabbage tub checked for its steady transformation, and the granary sacks turned to guard against the damp that lingers in the cooler air. The story of why medieval food met its daily adversary with such patient ingenuity flows onward into these new decades, where further shifts in agriculture, trade, and the slow stirrings of scientific observation would continue to test and quietly refine the same resilient techniques in the face of an ever-evolving continent. The story of why medieval food met its daily adversary with such patient ingenuity flows onward into these new decades, where further shifts in agriculture, trade, and the slow stirrings of scientific observation would continue to test and quietly refine the same resilient techniques in the face of an ever-evolving continent. In the early years of the 17th century, the village cottage stood much as it had for generations, its larder still the quiet battlefield where the housewife and her family waged their familiar campaign against moisture, warmth, and time. The raised granary now held a greater share of maize alongside the traditional rye and barley, while the root pits in the cool earth contained the first tentative plantings of potatoes, tubers that had slowly made their way northward from Iberian fields and were stored in sand or straw with the same careful layering once reserved for turnips and beets. These newcomers offered higher yields in good seasons and could be dried or fermented into forms that lasted through the winter, yet they too carried the old vulnerabilities. Their higher water content made them prone to soft rot if the pit walls grew damp, and the family learned through quiet trial that even these hardy roots required more frequent inspection than the drier grains of earlier centuries. The Little Ice Age continued its patient grip, bringing cooler summers and harsher winters that shortened the drying window and forced households to rely more heavily on salt and smoke. A harvest gathered under gray skies might enter storage with just enough residual dampness to invite mold by late autumn, compelling the housewife to spread smaller batches near the hearth on clearer days or to turn the sacks in the granary with greater frequency. The salted pork barrels, filled after the autumn slaughter, still needed their lids resealed with rendered fat whenever condensation appeared, and the cheeses in the north-facing cellar were turned more often to guard against uneven aging in the fluctuating temperatures. Fermentation remained the steadfast companion. The cabbage tub, now sometimes enriched with a handful of the new potatoes sliced thin, continued its slow lactic transformation under its weighted stone, producing a tangy preserve that cut through the heavier pottages and offered a reliable source of nourishment when fresh greens were scarce. The practical knowledge passed down through the fireside had been quietly augmented by the printed manuals that circulated even in rural areas, yet these pages could only advise. They could not change the wooden barrels that still swelled and split or the stone cellars that remained vulnerable to the damp air seeping through their walls. Early scientific observation, stirring in the universities and among a growing circle of natural philosophers, began to touch the edges of these everyday practices without yet transforming them. In some regions, physicians and gentlemen farmers experimented with ideas drawn from the new emphasis on empirical study, noting how certain herbs or the careful exclusion of air seemed to slow corruption in ways that humoral theory had only partially explained. A steward on a nearby estate might record in his account book the precise days when a barrel of salted herring showed the first signs of sliminess, comparing it against the temperature and humidity noted in a simple journal, or test whether boiling a brine before packing extended its life by a measurable week. These small acts of observation echoed the old attentiveness of the village housewife who judged by scent and touch, but they carried a subtle new confidence that knowledge itself might one day offer a firmer defense. Yet the deeper irony was that such stirrings remained distant from the cottage. The material world still offered no mechanical cold, no truly airtight containers beyond wax-sealed pottery or pitch-lined wood, And so the invisible forces of decay operated with the same relentless patience they had shown when the first medieval harvests were stored in raised barns. Trade networks, now more intricate and reaching farther across the Atlantic and into the Baltic, continued to supply the salt and occasional exotic additions that made preservation slightly more reliable for those who could afford them. Barrels of high-quality salt arrived more regularly through the ports, allowing heavier cures that extended the life of pork and herring even through the longer winters, while small quantities of cane sugar or olive oil found their way inland to wealthier tables where fruit conserves could be boiled down and sealed with wax for nearly a full year. In the towns, guild regulations reflected this growing sophistication, with inspectors demanding stricter standards for smoked meats and fermented goods sold at market. Yet the core challenge endured. A shipment delayed by storm or blockade could still leave a household stretching its stores, and the flies that arrived with the first warm days of spring still found their way to any meat not hung high enough or smoked thoroughly enough. The contradiction remained gently persistent. Wider commerce brought more tools to the battle, yet the absence of any true breakthrough in storage meant that abundance in a good year could still turn to scarcity almost overnight when the weather or the roads failed. Agricultural shifts, particularly the slow enclosure of common lands in parts of England and the adoption of new rotations in the Low Countries and northern France, altered the scale of the larder without erasing its daily demands. Families with access to slightly larger plots could plant more of the hardy potatoes or maize, drying the surplus on hurdles or storing it in deeper pits lined with straw. Yet the increased yields often meant more labor spent sifting and redrying to guard against the damp that lingered in the cooler climate. The calendar of slaughter and curing remained tied to the seasons as firmly as ever, with the autumn pig killing still a communal moment of shared labor and cautious hope that the barrels would hold until spring. In Protestant regions, the liturgical rhythms had eased in some respects, yet the practical need for long-keeping foods during lean periods kept the old techniques at the center of household life, now supplemented rather than replaced by the new crops that promise greater resilience if only the storage could be managed with equal care. As the 17th century moved into its middle decades, these accumulating pressures and quiet refinements began to intersect in ways that tested the old system more stringently. Population growth continued its slow upward climb, placing fresh demands on the land and the stores, while conflicts across the continent, whether the 30 Years' War on the mainland or the civil strife in Britain, disrupted trade routes and requisitioned supplies with the same urgency that medieval armies had once shown. A village caught between marching forces might bury its salted fish and dried maize in hidden pits only to retrieve them weeks later touched by moisture or the first faint bloom of mold, a reminder that no concealment could fully outpace the natural processes at work. The housewife in our cottage still rose with the dawn to inspect the drying racks and judge the scent from the chimney, yet her calculations now sometimes included the possibility of trading a wheel of aged cheese for a small barrel of imported salt or experimenting with a new variety of potato that a traveling merchant claimed would keep longer in the root pit. The deeper currents of agriculture, trade, and the first empirical observations were quietly reshaping the contours of the medieval world even as they left its fundamental constraints intact. The larder remained the quiet heart of survival, where the same intimate acts, turning the cheeses, resealing the barrels, lifting the lid on the cabbage tub, continued with unhurried insistence. Tomorrow the fire will be banked low once more, the covered bread will rest safely beside the fermentation tub, and the granary sacks will be turned against the damp that lingers in the air of these new decades. The story flows onward still, carrying the patient ingenuity of preservation into an age where further shifts in scientific understanding and global commerce would continue to test and subtly transform the same resilient techniques that had sustained European households through centuries of uncertainty. The story flows onward still, carrying the patient ingenuity of preservation into an age where further shifts in scientific understanding and global commerce would continue to test and subtly transform the same resilient techniques that had sustained European households through centuries of uncertainty. In the village cottage, as the 17th century deepened, those techniques met the new currents with the same quiet steadiness they had always shown, even as the housewife noticed small differences in the stores that now filled her larder. The root pits held larger quantities of potatoes alongside the familiar turnips, their skins carefully dried and layered in clean straw to guard against the soft rot that could spread quickly in the cooler, damper air of the Little Ice Age. The granary sacks mixed maize with rye in proportions that required more frequent turning to prevent the oils in the newer grain from turning rancid. Salted meats from the autumn slaughter still hung in the chimney or rested in barrels resealed with rendered fat. Yet the smoke was sometimes adjusted with a touch more care after a neighbor shared a printed note from a gentleman farmer suggesting that certain hardwoods deposited protective compounds more effectively when the fire burned low and steady. Early empirical observation, spreading from the universities and the correspondence of natural philosophers, began to filter into rural awareness through traveling merchants or the occasional estate steward who kept meticulous records. A physician in a nearby town might publish observations on how excluding air from a sealed jar of pickled vegetables slowed corruption far beyond what simple brining had achieved in earlier decades, or note that boiling a brine before packing reduced the invisible agents of spoilage in ways humoral theory had never fully explained. These ideas traveled slowly into the cottage, perhaps as a second-hand remark at market or a page copied into a household notebook, encouraging the housewife to experiment with tighter wax seals on small pottery jars of fruit conserves or to test whether a handful of the new potatoes, sliced and fermented with the cabbage, produced a sharper, longer-lasting preserve. The deeper irony remained gentle but unmistakable. The new emphasis on measurement and trial confirmed much of what generations had learned by scent and touch, yet it offered no mechanical means to halt decay entirely. Wooden barrels still leaked at the seams during temperature shifts, cellars still grew damp with the seasonal rains, and the absence of true refrigeration meant that every item in the larder carried its own quiet clock, ticking forward with the same patience it had shown when the first medieval harvests were stored in raised barns. Global commerce, now reaching deeper into the Americas and the East, brought both new ingredients and new pressures that tested the old system more stringently. Ships returning from colonial ports carried occasional barrels of dried maize or beans treated with techniques adapted from indigenous practices, sun-drying on woven mats or layering with local salts. But these goods still arrived vulnerable to the damp holds and long voyages, requiring the same inspections upon landing that a village housewife gave to her own stores. In the towns, guild inspectors examined imported preserves with heightened scrutiny, rejecting barrels of salted fish whose brine had weakened or smoked meats whose protective coating had cracked during the Atlantic crossing. For the cottage, the benefits appeared in small ways. A merchant might offer a pinch of better quality salt at fair price, allowing heavier cures that extended the life of pork through the longer winters, or a small sack of cane sugar that could transform windfall apples into conserves capable of lasting months when boiled down and sealed. Yet the contradiction persisted with quiet insistence. Greater variety in the larder meant more items to monitor, and a delayed shipment due to storm or blockade could still leave a household relying on fermentation and smoking at precisely the moment when the cooler climate made drying more uncertain. Agricultural changes, particularly the slow spread of new rotations and the enclosure of common fields in parts of England and the Low Countries, altered the scale without erasing the daily demands. Families with access to slightly larger holdings could plant more potatoes or maize, drying the surplus on elevated hurdles or storing it in deeper pits. Yet the increased yields often translated into more labor spent sifting for weevils or redrying batches touched by unexpected damp. The calendar of slaughter and curing remained anchored to the seasons as firmly as ever, with the autumn pig killing still a moment of communal vigilance where neighbors shared labor and cautious hope that the barrels would hold until spring. In regions recovering from the conflicts of the earlier decades, the return of stability allowed stewards on larger estates to experiment with ice houses, shallow pits packed with snow and insulated with straw, offering a modest extension of freshness for dairy and meat during the brief summer months, though these structures remained rare and far beyond the reach of the ordinary cottage. The practical knowledge of the fireside absorbed these refinements gradually, blending them with the old methods so that the turning of cheeses or the resealing of barrels felt like a natural continuation rather than a break with the past. As the century moved toward its later decades, These accumulating shifts began to intersect in ways that hinted at deeper transformations without yet providing escape from the fundamental realities. Population growth continued its measured rise, placing fresh demands on the land and the stores, while the expansion of colonial trade introduced occasional new plants, early varieties of tomatoes or peppers in southern regions, treated as curiosities and preserved through drying or pickling much like the old herbs. Printed manuals grew more detailed, sometimes including diagrams for improved barrel construction or notes on the temperature at which smoke deposited its protective layer most effectively, yet they still acknowledged the limits of wood and stone. The housewife in our village still rose with the dawn to inspect the drying racks and judge the scent from the chimney, yet her calculations now sometimes included the possibility of trading a wheel of aged cheese for a small quantity of imported salt or testing whether a layer of the new potatoes in the cabbage tub produced a preserve that kept its sharpness longer into the lean months. The deeper currents of scientific inquiry and global exchange were quietly reshaping the contours of daily life even as they left the core challenge of spoilage intact. The larder remained the quiet heart of survival, where the same intimate acts, lifting the lid on the fermentation tub, turning the cheeses in the cool cellar, resealing the barrels against the air, continued with unhurried insistence. Tomorrow the fire will be rekindled. The granary sacks turned once more against the lingering damp, and the cycle will resume in the root pits where the potatoes and turnips wait in their straw bedding. The story of why food spoiled so quickly, and how people met that daily adversary with such enduring ingenuity, flows onward still into the closing years of the century and the uncertain decades beyond, where further refinements in observation, trade, and agricultural practice would continue to test and subtly evolve the same resilient techniques that had carried European households through the long medieval centuries and into a world slowly awakening to new possibilities. The story of why food spoiled so quickly, and how people met that daily adversary with such enduring ingenuity, flows onward still into the closing years of the century and the uncertain decades beyond, where further refinements in observation, trade, and agricultural practice would continue to test and subtly evolve the same resilient techniques that had carried European households through the long medieval centuries and into a world slowly awakening to new possibilities. As the 17th century drew to its close and the 18th began to unfold, the village cottage remained anchored in the same intimate rhythms of vigilance that had defined its larder for generations, even as faint echoes of larger changes reached the fireside. The housewife still rose at first light to lift the lid on the cabbage tub, now sometimes mixed with thin slices of potato whose starch added body to the ferment yet required extra salt to keep the brine from weakening in the cooler air of the lingering Little Ice Age. The root pits held greater quantities of these new tubers, carefully layered in clean straw and checked for the soft, musty spots that could spread if condensation gathered against the earthen walls, while the granary sacks blended maize and rye in proportions that demanded more frequent turning to prevent the oils in the American grain from turning rancid under damp spells that had become almost seasonal. Printed manuals and the growing correspondence of gentlemen farmers offered quiet refinements without appending the old order. A neighbor might share a page describing how boiling a brine before packing reduced the invisible agents of corruption, an idea drawn from the early experiments of natural philosophers who were beginning to question the ancient language of humors in favor of careful measurement. The housewife might test such advice on a small jar of pickled vegetables sealed with wax, noting with quiet satisfaction that it kept its sharpness a week longer than the usual method. Yet the deeper truth endured. Wooden barrels still swelled and leaked during temperature shifts, cellars still grew damp with the seasonal rains, and the absence of any mechanical means to hold back warmth meant that every item in the stores carried its own quiet clock, ticking forward with the same patience it had shown when the first medieval harvests were stored in raised barns. The new emphasis on empirical trial confirmed much of what generations had learned by scent and touch, but it offered no sudden escape from the material limits of wood, stone, fire, and salt. Global commerce, now threading colonial ports more tightly into European networks, brought both opportunity and fresh complications to the daily battle. Ships returning from the Americas occasionally carried barrels of dried maize or beans treated with techniques adapted from distant practices. Yet these goods still arrived vulnerable to the damp holds and long ocean passages, requiring the same careful inspection a village housewife gave her own stores upon opening a barrel. In the market towns, guild inspectors examined imported preserves with stricter eyes, rejecting shipments of salted fish whose brine had weakened or smoked meats whose protective coating had cracked during the crossing. For the cottage, the benefits appeared modestly. A merchant at the fair might offer a finer grade of salt at a price that allowed heavier cures for the autumn pork, extending its life through the longer winters, or a small measure of cane sugar that could turn windfall apples into conserves capable of lasting months when boiled down and sealed. Yet the gentle contradiction remained. Greater variety meant more items to monitor, and a delayed convoy due to storm or naval conflict could still leave a household stretching its fermentation and smoking at the very moment when the cooler climate made sun-drying unreliable. Agricultural shifts, particularly the wider adoption of new crop rotations and the slow enclosure of open fields in parts of England and the Low Countries, altered the scale of the larder without erasing its daily demands. Families with access to slightly larger holdings could plant more potatoes or maize, drying the surplus on elevated hurdles or storing it in deeper pits. Yet the increased yields often translated into more labor spent sifting for weevils or redrying batches touched by unexpected damp. The calendar of slaughter and curing stayed tied to the seasons as firmly as ever, with the autumn pig killing still a moment of communal vigilance where neighbors shared labor and cautious hope that the barrels would hold until spring. In regions recovering from earlier conflicts, the return of stability allowed stewards on larger estates to experiment with rudimentary ice houses, shallow pits packed with winter snow and insulated with straw, offering a modest extension of freshness for dairy and meat during the brief summer months, though these structures remained rare and far beyond the reach of the ordinary cottage. The practical knowledge of the fireside absorbed these refinements gradually, blending them with the old methods so that the turning of cheeses or the resealing of barrels felt like a natural continuation rather than a break with the past. As the 18th century gathered momentum, these accumulating pressures and quiet innovations began to intersect in ways that hinted at deeper transformations while leaving the core challenge of spoilage intact. Population growth continued its steady rise, placing fresh demands on the land and the stores, while the expansion of colonial trade introduced occasional new plants, early varieties of tomatoes or peppers in southern regions, treated as curiosities and preserved through drying or pickling much like the old herbs. Printed manuals grew more detailed, sometimes including diagrams for improved barrel construction or notes on the temperature at which smoke deposited its protective layer most effectively, yet they still acknowledged the limits of wood and stone. The housewife in our village still inspected the drying racks at dawn and judged the scent rising from the chimney, yet her calculations now sometimes included the possibility of trading a wheel of aged cheese for a small quantity of imported salt or testing whether a layer of the new potatoes in the cabbage tub produced a preserve that kept its sharpness longer into the lean months. The deeper currents of scientific inquiry and global exchange were quietly reshaping the contours of daily life even as they left the fundamental realities unchanged. Early societies dedicated to useful knowledge began to circulate letters and pamphlets that discussed the nature of fermentation and putrefaction in terms that moved beyond ancient theory, yet the practical effect on the cottage larder remained modest and incremental. A steward might record in his account book the precise conditions under which a barrel of salted herring showed the first signs of sliminess, comparing it against weather notes in a simple journal, ideas that filtered slowly into rural conversation through market gossip or the occasional traveling peddler. These small acts of observation echoed the old attentiveness of the village housewife who judged by scent and touch, but they carried a subtle new confidence that knowledge itself might one day offer a firmer defense. Though the material world still offered no mechanical cold, no truly airtight containers beyond wax or pitch, and so the invisible forces of decay operated with the same relentless patience they had shown across the medieval centuries. In the towns, where populations swelled once more, the the market squares reflected this evolving balance with sharper precision. Guilds maintained their inspections of salted meats and cheeses, demanding that barrels show no signs of graying or sliminess before sale, while dairy women churned butter in cooler underground rooms and packed it in salted layers for the short journey to the stalls. Brewers adjusted their recipes with stronger hops or new strains of yeast to give ale a longer life, reducing the frequency with which fresh batches needed to be exposed to air, and bakers produced harder biscuits suited for the increasing numbers of merchants and soldiers whose routes now stretched across an ever more connected continent. The slow integration of additional crops from distant continents, potatoes becoming a more reliable staple in some regions, maize finding its place in pottages, added new possibilities without immediately solving old problems. These newcomers could be dried or stored in sand, yet they too absorbed moisture readily and required the same careful placement in the root pit or loft to avoid the soft rot that had claimed turnips for generations. The nobility and wealthier merchants, with their larger cellars and access to imported luxuries, maintained larders that still served as quiet demonstrations of prudent mastery. Olive oil in sealed jars remained almost permanent, its natural barrier against air as effective as ever, while small quantities of sugar allowed for fruit conserves that could endure months when properly boiled and sealed. These refinements highlighted the contrast with the village cottage, where the same wooden barrels, stone walls, and hearth fires governed every decision, and where a single leaky lid or a forgotten turning of the cheese could mean the difference between sustenance and scarcity. The gentle contradiction persisted. Wider trade and printed knowledge brought more tools to the battle, yet the invisible forces of decay operated with the same relentless patience they had shown in the 13th century. A wet summer still turned grain black with mold. Flies still found their way to meat hung too low, and the calendar of slaughter, drying, and fermentation still dictated the household's year more firmly than any distant royal edict or market fluctuation. As the 18th century moved into its middle decades, the rhythms in the village continued with the same unhurried steadiness that had defined them across the long span from the medieval world. The housewife still lifted the lid on the cabbage tub each morning, still judged the firmness of the cheeses in the cellar, and still planned the winter stores with the accumulated caution of those who had seen good years turn lean without warning. Her children absorbed the lessons by example, recognizing the faint bloom on bacon or the telltale softness in a stored root, skills that bound them to the generations before even as the wider world of exploration and commerce pressed closer. The deeper currents of population recovery, climatic challenge, and the gradual integration of new crops had altered the texture of daily life without erasing the core reality. Food still spoiled so quickly because the world had yet to offer any true means of halting the natural processes that had shaped European larders since the early Middle Ages. Tomorrow the fire will be rekindled once more, the drying racks checked for the first signs of mold in the cooler air, and the cycle will resume in the granary where the mixed sacks of maize and rye wait beside the root pits. The story of why medieval food met its daily adversary with such patient ingenuity flows onward into these new decades, where further shifts in scientific understanding, agricultural improvement, and the slow stirrings of industrial possibility would continue to test and quietly reshape the same resilient techniques in the face of a continent slowly moving beyond the medieval world yet still bound by its most fundamental constraints. The story of why medieval food met its daily adversary with such patient ingenuity flows onward into these new decades, where further shifts in scientific understanding, agricultural improvement, and the slow stirrings of industrial possibility would continue to test and quietly reshape the same resilient techniques in the face of a continent slowly moving beyond the medieval world yet still bound by its most fundamental constraints. Over time, those same methods of salting, smoking, fermenting, and careful drying would begin their gradual retreat from the center of daily life. Ice houses grew more common on larger estates, packed with winter snow and insulated with straw to offer a few precious extra days of freshness for butter and meat. Early experiments with sealed jars and boiling brines hinted at preservation beyond the old reliance on wood and fire, while the first tentative steps toward canning and vacuum sealing in the late 18th and early 19th centuries pointed toward a world where the spoilage clock might finally be slowed in ways the medieval household could scarcely have imagined. Eventually, mechanical refrigeration would arrive in the 19th and 20th centuries, breaking the ancient race against decay for ordinary families and rendering the old calendar of slaughter, drying, and vigilant turning largely invisible. Yet even as these innovations took hold, the medieval inheritance did not disappear. Many of the techniques born in those damp cottages and castle larders survived as cherished regional traditions. The quiet foundation of aged cheeses, cured hams, sauerkraut-like ferments, and smoked fish that we still seek out today not merely for sustenance but for the layered flavors that necessity and time once coaxed from simple ingredients. The very act of preserving food had never been only about survival. It had been a form of quiet mastery over the seasons, a way of turning limitation into something enduring and, in its own way, deeply satisfying. Looking back across the long arc we have followed together, from the late summer mornings of the year 1300, through the tightening pressures of the Little Ice Age, the devastations of famine and plague, the religious upheavals of the Reformation, and the gradual arrival of new crops from distant continents. What stands out is not a tale of unrelenting hardship alone, but one of remarkable human adaptability and practical intelligence. Medieval Europeans did not live passively at the mercy of spoilage. They developed an intimate generational knowledge of their environment, working in close partnership with salt and smoke, with the subtle chemistry of lactic fermentation, and with the patient rhythms of the hearth and the root pit. The larder was never merely a storage place. It was a daily theater of negotiation between human effort and the natural world, where every turned wheel of cheese, every resealed barrel, and every carefully hung side of bacon represented a small but meaningful victory against the invisible forces that sought to return everything to the earth. In our own era, when refrigeration hums quietly in nearly every kitchen and food can travel thousands of miles without turning, it is easy to forget how recently that victory had to be won anew each season. This distance allows us to see the medieval experience with clearer, more respectful eyes. Not as a world of constant misery and ignorance, but as one where practical wisdom, communal knowledge, and attentive care sustained life through conditions that would test any generation. The spoilage that once shaped calendars, economies, trade routes, social hierarchies, and even the very taste of what people considered good or safe now feels distant, yet it reminds us of a fundamental truth that still connects us to our ancestors, that the simplest necessities have often demanded the most thoughtful ingenuity. As we bring this long, calm journey to its close, one might pause to reflect. Which detail of that daily struggle against spoilage surprised you most? Or which aspect of medieval life feels the hardest for us in our refrigerated world to truly imagine living through? Thank you for listening with such quiet attention through these many hours. If these thoughtful, unhurried explorations of the past have offered you companionship or rest, I hope you will join us again for the next chapter in this ongoing story of humanity's long conversation with history. Until then, may your evenings be peaceful and your rest deep.